Markdown is a markup language that allows you to easily write formatted text. If you want to create content-heavy sites like blogging websites or documentation sites, you would benefit from using Markdown for your content. Now, MDX extends Markdown and allows you to bring in JSX and React components into your otherwise static text content and make them dynamic. In this video, I'll show you how you can use two different packages to incorporate MDX with NextJs. Hey, my name is Hamed. Welcome to the party and let's get into it. I have documented everything that I learned working with MDX in a single blog post on my site, and I'm going to include a link in the description so you can follow along if you like. And in this video, I'm going to go over that note step by step, trying to incorporate MDX in our NextJs app. Now, to get started, let's just touch on Markdown one more time. Markdown is a simple, lightweight markup language. There's this site called Markdown Guide, and there's a cheat sheet here. Again, a link will be in the description that shows you different syntax you could use to turn regular text into, let's say, headings, H1s and H3, make them bold, make them italic, create block quotes, lists, and so forth and so on. Now, if you've ever worked with GitHub repository README pages, those are written using the Markdown language. As an example, if you were to just write a simple paragraph in HTML as a block code, you would have had to include these HTML tags with a paragraph tag and an emphasize tag. Whereas in Markdown, it would be as easy as just including this signature here that denotes this as a block code, and this underscores around this that makes that an italic word. Now, what MDX does is it allows you to bring in JSX or React components into your static text content. So not only with Markdown, it's easy to write content. With MDX that allows you to bring in JSX, you can make those static content now dynamic. Now, under the hood, MDX is using remark and rehype processors. These are the processors used to process Markdown and turn them into HTML. And you can use any plugin for these two processors with your MDX, because under the hood, it's using the same processors. Now, using MDX with NextJS, you have two general approaches that are mainly differ from where your content and data is living. If your content is stored locally in your NextJS app, you can use a package called NextMDX, which is from NextJS team, that allows you to write top-level MDX files or pages in your pages folder. As you would have done with your regular React pages, you can just write MDX pages. It will compile them and shows them as pages on the corresponding path. Now, if your files, your content, your Markdown files are living remotely in a different, maybe repository in a database or coming from a CMS, and you would like to fetch them like any other data in get server-side props or get static props for every page, you can use a package called NextMDX Remote that allows you to fetch MDX content remotely inside get server-side props and get static props. We're going to go over both packages in this tutorial. Let's start with the NextMDX. To get this working, you have to install these two packages, so NextMDX and MDX.js Loader. I've already installed this, so you can go ahead and install these two. Once you install those two, you have to change your next config.js to allow NextJS to read top-level MDX files or extensions. I think I've already done this. Let me just double check. Yep, so we already have this config changed. Now, once you change that config, make sure to restart your development server. And once you've installed the package and changed your config.js, all you need to do is to create an MDX page in your pages folder, and that's it. So let's actually go ahead and do that. So in our pages folder, I'm going to create a directory called blog, and in it, I'm going to create my first post.mdx. And I'm going to start writing Markdown here. This is my first post. So let's see if our site can render this at blog first post. There we have it. our Markdown file is compiled to a React component and shown as a page. Easy. So just to show that we can write JSX over here, let's just actually include JSX. This is JSX. Let's also give it some color. I'm using Tailwind, so I'm going to say text, red maybe 400. And as you can see, we have this also JSX brought into the page along with our Markdown. Now, if you're wondering why this was an H1, according to this cheat sheet, this text should be an H1 and should be bold. Well, I'm using Tailwind, and in Tailwind what happens is that it resets all the browser style. To bring them back in, I'm going to include a function here, and I'm going to explain what this does later on in the video, but for now just accept this from me. And all we're doing here is that I'm going to wrap the content of my file with an article. I'm going to give it a class name so Tailwind can go ahead and style them for me. And this is happening because I'm using a plugin for Tailwind. It's called Tailwind Typography, that's suitable for styling this type of content. I'm going to explain what this default function is that I'm exporting from here later on, but for now just ignore that. We are writing Markdown content. For example, I can add a list by saying maybe item 1 and item 2 and different stuff. Now, as I mentioned already, it doesn't stop there. We can use components as well. So if we have an external component, we can import it in our Markdown file and we can use it in our Markdown file. For this, I've created a simple hello.js JSX component that just says hello world. So I have an external component and I want to import that external component into my Markdown file and use that inside of my Markdown file. So from components /hello, and here I'm just going to render that component. Let's go back to our page, and as you can see, this hello world is showing up there. Now again, it doesn't stop there. You can also include any JavaScript expressions in your Markdown file. For example, I can say I have a div over here, and inside of it maybe I can run a JavaScript expression math.floor and floor this number down to the closest integer, and as you can see here, the result is outputted there. So I'm including JavaScript expressions in my JSX inside of my Markdown files. We can also use ESM import and export statements to not only import external components as we've seen already, but also export local components and use them in the file. So on top of this external component, I can also export a local component. Let's call it local component, and let's just render something like a div. We're in love with this meaningless divs. So, and I'm going to say this is a local component. Going back to the page, let's refresh. Where's the local component? Oh, I didn't use it anywhere, so I've defined it here. But let's say down in the bottom here, I say let's render this local component. There you have it. So we can use ESM import and exports to import external components, to export local components and use them in the MDX. We can also use import and exports to import data or export variables that we can then use in the JSX. So I can also, on top of components, I can export variables. So const, let's say year equals 2022, and then I can use this inside of here to say, hey, year is 2022. So I defined a local variable. I'm not exporting, good to know, I'm not exporting this variable up there, so it's not actually able to use it. So exporting a component, a local variable or a component to then make it available in the content of your MDX. Okay, great. Now, what's happening behind the scene is that the next MDX is compiling our Markdown and turning the main content of our files into React components. And because of that, we can export and import MDX files also to other MDX files. Let me show you what I mean. So if I go here and in my pages and blog, create a second post, .mdx, what I can do is that I can include the first post that I have, import that from the first post.mdx, and just render it over here, first post. And to just show this is different, I'm going to include this is my second post up top. So if I now go to that page to say second post, I can see this is coming completely from the first post because I just got that here as a component and then I included this second post over here. So the point is that your MDX pages are exported as React components. And therefore, because they're React components, not only you can define local variables like we did here, the year variable, not only you can import and export local and external components to them, but you can also pass props to these components. For example, I have this file over here, example MDX. This is a Markdown file, and inside of it, I'm expecting props.name. So I'm expecting a prop to be passed to this component. So when I'm rendering this component in my home JSX, which is my home page or my home component, I'm importing the React component exported from my MDX file. And when rendering, I'm passing to it this name property that's expected inside of this file. So as you can see, it turns them into React components, and you can use the same component-based principles you would use in React with your Markdown content. Now, furthermore, if you want to add a layout to your blog posts, let's say you have a specific layout for your blogs, you have a specific layout component for your projects, maybe this is a portfolio site, you can wrap the content of your Markdown in a specific layout. For example, I have a blog layout that I've created here, and all I do is I export a default function that just takes in the children, which is the content of our Markdown file, and wraps it in the blog layout component. And that's exactly what I did in the beginning, and I said I'm going to explain it later. All I'm doing here, I'm not wrapping it with any layout, but I'm just wrapping the content of my MDX file in an article tag so that I can give it a class so that Tailwind can style it. But you could use the same functionality to wrap your content in any blog layout or specific layout that you want. Now, if you have worked with Markdown before, you may be familiar with a concept called front matter. Front matter is typically a YAML format you would include in the beginning of each Markdown file that contains metadata about the page. Now, how would we use this in MDX? Unfortunately, MDX itself does not support front matter. It does not understand the front matter, but there's so many solutions we can use to actually use front matter with MDX. One of them is gray matter. I'm going to come back to gray matter, a third-party package that extracts this data and allows you to work with it. But before we get there, we can also use the ESM import and export features that's already supported with MDX to create maybe a custom meta variable, which is an object in our file containing data about the title, the author, the date, and anything that we want, and then use that metadata property or local variable inside of our Markdown files. Now, this may solve some of the problems, but you may still prefer front matter because it allows you to extract information about each file by reading your files from the file system before actually compiling your Markdown. Because when you're including the metadata as a variable inside your MDX files, this file needs to be compiled first before this variable is accessible. But front matter, if you could read the content of the file from the file system and just parse this front matter out without compiling any Markdown, you could still access this front matter. And that's why we're going to use the gray matter package. Let's see how we're going to use this. This is a file or a function that you would create in your project. And in this function, we're going to get a slug that's an identification for our blog posts, and the slug is what appears up there as the name. I don't know if you can see that or not. It's also a unique identifier for our blog posts, and it's also the file name. In my case, the file name is the same as my slugs. So I'm going to get a slug and try to find that file and read the content of that file using the FS module from Node.js. Once I read the content, I will pass the content of the file to this matter, which is a function I imported from gray matter, which then parses the Markdown file and extracts this front matter out of it, and we now have access to this data. Now, as mentioned earlier, MDX doesn't understand front matter by default. So what's going to happen is if you include front matter in your MDX files, they're going to show up on your page. Let me show you what I mean. So if I have some front matter over here in my first post, imagine these are my front matter. So let's say this is my first blog post, right? If I go to my page now, and if I navigate to the first post, sorry, you can see that the front matter also showed up as content in my MDX file. We need a way to tell MDX that this is front matter, ignore it. Well, luckily there's a plugin for it. There's a remark plugin that we can use called remark front matter that just does that. It tells NextMDX or the engine, the processor, to ignore the front matter. To install it, you have to install the package first. Then you have to include that plugin as your remark plugin in your next config.js. But there is another problem. The remark front matter is an ESM only package. Right now, our config.js in next config.js is a common JS module because we're using module.exports. But luckily, from Next.js 12, ES modules are also supported, and all you need to do is that you need to rename your config.js to config.mjs, and now you can bring in ESM import and export syntax or modules. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this whole thing and replace this with this content that allows me to use import and export, ESM import and export syntax, and I have brought in this remark front matter plugin that I have imported up here by installing this package. Now let me just restart the development server. And go back to our page. Now the content of this should go away. Yep. So as you can see, now MDX is able to ignore the front matter. Okay, so now let's actually use this front matter that we have over here. Let me just copy this to also my second post and use this in action. So I'm going to go to my second post, also include some front matter over here. I'm just going to say this is my second post. Maybe give this a different date. I'm not using the date, but anyways. So I have included this function that's similar to the function that we have already seen. Inside the lib folder, I have this posts function or file. And what I'm doing here is that I have two functions, get post meta or metadata and get all posts meta. What this first function does is that it takes a slug, finds the file based on this slug, reads the content of the file, passes the content to matter. Matter extracts the data or the metadata, the front matter from the file, and returns the metadata. So far so good. Get all posts meta is going to go ahead and read the content of the directory. My directory is pages and blog. I've said to read the content of this root directory, which I defined up there, which is pages blog. So it's going to go in the pages blog, read the files that it has in here, and for each file it's going to pass the slug to this get post metadata, which then reads the content of that file and extracts the metadata, and it's going to return an array of my posts metadata. And the idea is that we would, on our home page, try to access the metadata of our posts to then create a list here so that the user can click on and then be brought to the actual blog post. So let's do this. Let's go to our index.jsx and export an async function called get server side props, and inside of it what we're going to do is we're going to just call the get all posts meta that we created in our lib folder, and what we're going to do is to return these posts as props to our page. So our page now is going to get this posts metadata. Okay, now let me just change the styling in my component over here. This is something that I have created already with Tailwind. Let me just import the link and I'll explain what this is doing here. So link from next link. Okay, so all we're doing over here, let me just refresh the page and you can see the links over here. So all I'm doing over here is that I'm getting these posts that we fetched server side by reading the content of our pages folder, the blogs, and extracting the metadata from our posts and send an array of all metadata to our home page here to the client side. We are mapping every post that we have to an unordered list that shows a link to that specific post with a title. So you can see here I have my first blog post, my second blog post, and if I click on them it will take me to those corresponding pages. Custom components. Now, sometimes you may want to use custom components for regular HTML elements or any custom component that you're including in your MDX file without having to import them or define them locally. What do I mean by this? Now, here in the first blog post, for example, I have imported this external hello component or defined a local component and used it in my file. What if here, for an example, I have a custom link component I'm using in a Markdown file, but I haven't imported this or defined this locally? Or maybe this custom link is a component that I want to use in all of my MDX files. So for this, what we can do is when we are rendering this example.com as a React component, so we're importing this example from our example MDX, and when we are rendering it in our home page, similar to the example we had before, we can pass a prop to it, a specific prop called components, which expects an object like this, mapping component names to the actual component. So let me say it again. So when we are rendering our MDX components, we can pass them a specific prop called components, which is expecting an object, and this object maps component names to actual components. So therefore, when I'm rendering this example.com, I'm passing it this component that has this custom link that this guy is rendering here. When compiling this, it knows what this is. Otherwise, we should either import this right here in the file or locally define this. Now with this technique, what we can do is that we can add custom styles to any element. Since Markdown at the end of the day turns into HTML elements, we can create our custom components that map to regular HTML tags. What do I mean by this? Well, for example, in this component object that I'm going to pass to my MDX component, I'm going to say whenever you encounter an h1 tag, instead of it, use this heading.h1 component that I am defining. So this is a custom component that I'm saying mapping to any h1 tag, any h2, any anchor tag, any images. So I'm creating my own custom components for regular HTML tags to be used. Now, instead of having to pass this custom components to every MDX component that I'm rendering, we can use something called MDX provider, which is a React context provider. And all it does is that it takes those component objects, those custom component mapping, and shares that as a context with all of our MDX components. So all of our components now have access to these custom components. To do this, you have to install the MDX.js React package, which is a React context provider, and we have to specify a provider's import source in our next config.js. So I'm going to include this line. I've already installed this package. So all I'm going to do here is that I'm going to open next config.js, and in our options, I'm going to add this provider so I can use it as a provider. Let me just restart the dev server. And how we're going to use this is we're going to go to our _app.js. It's a context provider. So here I'm going to wrap my whole app with this MDX provider. Let me just uncomment these guys. So what are we doing here? We have wrapped our whole app. Well, this is the layout. You can ignore that layout, but MDX provider is a context provider. I'm wrapping my whole app in MDX provider, and I'm passing a components prop to this context provider, which is this custom object I'm providing that maps custom HTML tags to custom components that will be used in all of my MDX components, replacing these tags with these components, allowing me to have custom styles. By doing this, for example, I've turned all of my H1s to H1 tags that are just yellow. So now that I'm doing this, if I go back to my post, my H1 tags turned into yellow. And as simple as this, you can create your own custom styling for any of the HTML tags that you have. You can create a components object, map HTML tags to your custom component, use the MDX provider to share this context with all of your MDX components, and you're going to have a custom styled markdown file or pages. Now that's it for NextMDX. Let's see how NextMDX Remote, that other third-party package, works. Now you can use NextMDX Remote to load MDX content through get static props or get server-side props, the same way you would load any other data. So the way that it works is that this package will expose to you a function called serialize, which is a function that's supposed to be run server-side, and an MDX Remote component. So for example, inside of your get static props, you're going to fetch an MDX content called source here. For example, I have this MDX string over here, but this would come from local files, databases, remote repositories, anywhere. This is get server side, get static props, and you can just fetch any type of data from any remote location that you want, and then pass that MDX string or MDX content to this serialized function. The serialized function is going to extract the MDX source and pass that source to your page as a prop. So our page now, this test page, now has access to this MDX source. This MDX source is meant to be passed directly into this MDX remote component that is also exposed from this package. So you pass the source to this MDX remote, and this will render your MDX content in your React component. Now optionally, you can also pass components to it. It's a similar concept to the components that we've seen in the NextMDX package. that allows you to define components that are used inside of your MDX. For example, in this sample text, sample markdown that I'm sending here, there's this test component inside of this MDX string that I'm defining up here. I'm saying this test component you're going to see in the MDX. I'm mapping the test to this test component that I'm importing from my component. So for example, I have a custom link, a custom test, whatever component, and I'm saying, hey, when you see this component, use this guy. And I'm passing that component the same way I used before as a components prop to this MDX remote component. So some logic is kind of similar, some is different. Mainly that we're fetching and compiling our MDX inside our get static props or get server side props. As I explained, MDX remote just consumes the output of this serialize function and it just renders your MDX directly in your components. There are other options you can pass in to the serialize function, including different plugins for remark and rehype. You can read through this different options you can pass to these functions. Also, you can pass in other props to this MDX remote component other than the components prop that we've already seen. You can pass lazy, scope, and compiled source to it. You can read what these do in here. But as a caveat, when you're using NextMDX remote, the ESM import and export statements are not supported. If you need to use components in your MDX files, you should pass them like components to this MDX remote that we used up here. Or you can use a similar approach with the MDX provider, the context provider, and provide those custom components to all of your MDX remote packages. So this part of it is the exact same way and package as what we did in the previous step, where you would install this MDX.js React, which is the context provider. You would wrap your top level app component with this MDX provider and pass your custom components so that all of your MDX remote components have access to these custom components. Now, to summarize, when you're using NextMDX remote, you're not limited to just storing your MDX files locally. First of all, they can live anywhere, in a database, in a remote repository, in a CMS. Also, moving files around locally doesn't change the URL of your pages, because in NextMDX, you are literally creating MDX files in your pages folder. Moving these files around will change their URLs too, because the URLs in Next.js is just literally it's a file system based path or routing, whereby this file is just accessed through blog / second post or first post. So have this in mind. Now, while this gives you flexibility because you can now have your content living anywhere and changing them or moving them around doesn't actually change your site's URLs, it's not also as powerful as NextMDX when it comes to features like importing and exporting ESM, importing and exporting components, or creating JavaScript or including JavaScript expressions, or creating local variables that you can use. It does not have those features. So there's pros to it because you can have your content stored remotely and fetch them the same way as any other data inside get static props and get server side props, but it does not have the features we see from ESM modules in NextMDX. So to summarize, if you have a lot of files that all import, define, and use different components, or if you want to use the same component-based principles you have in React, you're better off using the NextMDX package or the first package we explained. But if you want to have the flexibility of storing your files and contents remotely and fetch them the same way you would fetch any other data inside get server side props and get static props, the NextMDX remote is a better package. Now you might think, why would I want to have my contents in a different repository? Now, if you, for example, are creating a documentation site whereby you have so many different pages, you don't want to rebuild your site anytime that you're making an edit to a page in your documentation. So there are two different repositories. You're just fetching them from a different repository and showing them like any other data in Next.js. Depending on your use case, you can benefit from different features these two packages are going to offer you. That's it for me, folks. If you learned anything from this video, give it a like. I would appreciate your comments and your feedback. Consider subscribing to my channel. It really helps me create videos like this. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.